I guess I don't need to stress how important the U.S.-China relation is in everyone's life. And today, we have assembled a great panel for this topic. And I would like to introduce our panel moderator, Mr. John Jia. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Yes, just as Narenchin said, won't be exaggeration to say how important the U.S.-China relations. Our panel today is focusing on this subject, and also we'll talk about how it affects our Chinese Americans. China's rapid economic development, growth, and increasing regional and global influence have unexpectedly shifted the geopolitical terrain in Asia-Pacific. As a result, U.S.-China relations have evolved to a complex mix of increasingly intertwined economics and societies, growing international rivalry, and intensified diplomacy. In our session, in light of the upcoming American general election, 3 renowned China hands on my left side will address the foreign policy complexities presented by the economic growth and the tense geopolitical situations around China, and how our foreign policies should evolve to best cope with the challenges while promoting bilateral cooperation. The panelists will also discuss, as I said, the impact of our China policies have on Chinese Americans. Our first speaker, this is a very distinguished panel. Our first speaker will be Ambassador Stapleton Roy, and he is, in any sense, truly a China hand. He was born in China. His father was teacher in Jingling University in Nanjing. He speaks fluent Chinese. He finished his elementary and middle school studies in China, and also he watched at the roof of the American school in Shanghai, see the PLA marching in Shanghai. Right after that, he came back and then graduated from Princeton University. This morning we have a Harvard team, and this afternoon I probably would say we have a Princeton school. Dr. Li, the second over there, was a PhD from Princeton University. And I believe Dr. Huiyao Wang must have some connection with Princeton University. Anyway, and then Ambassador Roy joined the Foreign Service, State Department, for more than 40 years. He served as, related to China, first Deputy Director of the office in China before the foreign relationship, diplomatic relationship established between 2 countries. And he actually involved the negotiation of U.S.-China diplomatic relationship established. And he then also served as ambassador for 3 countries, first Singapore, and then Indonesia and China. So he knows Asia, East Asia, and the Pacific, especially China, very well. And the highest ranking he served at State Department was Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Research. And right after retirement from the State Department, he joined the Kissinger consulting firm, which is a strategic consulting firm. And then after that, he joined Woodrow Wilson Center as the founding director of the Kissinger Institute and the senior fellow. Okay, let's welcome Ambassador Roy, and would like to see what he is going to tell us about the U.S.-China relationship status today, as well as the prospects. Welcome.
Good afternoon. Thank you for that introduction, Mr. Job. Much too long. I'd forgotten some of those details, so I was happy to be reminded of them. Congratulations also to the United Chinese Americans for holding this inaugural convention. I wish it every success. Today is September 9th. And it's noteworthy that this is the 40th anniversary of the death of Chairman Mao Zedong. While the chairman was alive, he and President Nixon, because of their common concern about the Soviet threat, created the extraordinary breakthrough in U.S.-China relations that stunned the world and reversed the course of the Cold War. Everyone at the time, and I was serving in the Soviet Union at that time, and I would say especially the Soviet Union, recognized the enormous geopolitical implications of this breakthrough in U.S.-China relations. No one anticipated that this development would also pave the way for China's breathtaking subsequent great leap forward into modernity, which amounted to moving away from China's Maoist past and developing the economy at the most rapid pace in human history. This was caused by that breakthrough, or at least that was a major contributing factor, and this aspect of it was not expected. Ironically, China and Russia are now moving closer together, at least in part because of a common concern about the American threat. And this is something that Americans need to think about very seriously when we consider the future of U.S.-China relations. In the U.S. presidential campaign, elements in the media are portraying the Democratic candidate, Hillary Clinton, as a hardliner on China. Meanwhile, the Republican candidate, Donald Trump, is threatening to impose massive tariffs on Chinese imports to the United States at a time when he may need Chinese assistance in building a Great Wall on the Mexican border. Both of the candidates are acting as though they will be tough in dealing with China. Now, let me say a few words about toughness. Why is it that we are always given a choice between toughness and accommodation in dealing with China? Skillful diplomacy always involves elements of both. Knowing when to be tough and when to be accommodating is what diplomacy is all about. Examples abound. Lee Kuan Yew had the guts to stand up to confrontasi by Sukarno in Indonesia, but most of the time he found it in Singapore's interest to accommodate Indonesia. Thailand kept its independence during the 19th century by accommodating the avaricious colonial powers, while all of Thailand's neighbors succumbed to colonialism. John F. Kennedy took a tough public posture during the Cuban Missile Crisis toward Khrushchev, but behind the scenes, he privately accommodated the Soviets by agreeing to remove American missiles from Turkey. Saddam Hussein took a tough line and suffered the consequences. North Korean leaders make a virtue of being tough, and they pay the price of perpetual isolation. There's nothing good about toughness It's only appropriate when it's appropriate. And it's not something that anyone should be proud of as their only characteristic. You need to balance both. Now, obviously, the state of U.S.-China relations should be of concern, not only to Americans who care about our relationship with China, but also for Asian Americans, and not simply Chinese Americans. When the state of U.S.-China relations is bad, there is a spillover effect that adversely impacts on the well-being of all Americans who look like Asians, not just Chinese Americans. If you don't believe me, ask your Muslim friends what it's like being an Islamic American at a time when Islam is associated in the minds of many Americans with terrorism. So we have to be concerned that U.S.-China relations don't contribute to an atmosphere in the United States that makes it difficult to express one's Asianness. Against this background, let's consider the current state of U.S.-China relations. The great American humorist Mark Twain is credited with popularizing the statement that Wagner's music is better than it sounds. My assessment of Sino-US relations is that they are better than it looks. Let's begin by looking at recent developments. The media carried extensive stories claiming that the Chinese had deliberately treated President Obama with disrespect by failing to provide aircraft stairs for his arrival in Hangzhou. This is nonsense. And when I first heard the story, I knew it was nonsense. Something was missing. Well, it turns out there were two sets of stairs available for the arrival, one Chinese and one American. On previous visits to China, President Obama has sometimes used American stairs, and he sometimes used Chinese stairs. So any of us here would have been able to solve this question within a few seconds by flipping a coin. There was no important issue of principle involved. And yet an idiotic standoff was permitted to emerge by these low-level staffers, which was not resolved until it was too late to get any stairs to the aircraft. This is the true story. And yet today in the Washington Post, one of their journalists is again wrote a big column about the significance of China's treating the President of the United States with disrespect, which was false. And the facts are now known. So why are these types of stories appearing? This is the sort of problem that constantly arises in U.S.-China relations. What are some of the facts? Let's look at some of them. Just before his meeting with President Xi Jinping in Hangzhou, after he had left the aircraft, President Obama publicly thanked President Xi and his entire government for the constructive way in which China and the United States had worked together in preparation for the meeting he was about to have. At the conclusion of the meeting, the White House issued a fact sheet stating that the two leaders commended the progress achieved in strengthening the foundation of the bilateral relationship and committed to continuing to manage differences constructively and expand practical cooperation on regional and global challenges. Is that the way a president of the United States would talk if he thought he had been deliberately treated with disrespect by the Chinese? Quite the opposite. In this White House fact sheet, there followed a lengthy list of the areas where China and the United States had agreed to cooperate, including, and I won't go through the entire list, I'll just hit some of the high points: peacekeeping, refugees, maritime risk reduction, Iraq, space cooperation, Afghanistan, nuclear security, counter-narcotics, law enforcement, counter-terrorism, cybersecurity, military relations, and, believe it or not, subnational cooperation on municipal governance. Now, this is just on the non-economic side. An even longer fact sheet was issued on the U.S.-China economic relationship. In it, the United States did not specifically endorse the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, but it included the statement that the two sides agreed, and I quote, to work together to support economic development in developing countries with the help of international financial institutions. Well, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is one of those financial institutions. So in an indirect way, the president was essentially making up for the fact that the United States made a fool of itself by publicly seeming to oppose the formation of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. They also noted in this statement that the two sides had made further progress in all aspects of the negotiations on a bilateral investment treaty. That's a very important development because the bilateral investment treaty between China and the United States is a high-end treaty with very rigorous provisions, and we're making progress on it. Against this background, I would characterize U.S.-China relations as normal. We're two big countries. We have differences, and we have enormous areas of cooperation between us. The differences are particularly challenging to manage when one country is rising rapidly and is challenging the dominant position of the other country. And that's the situation in U.S.-China relations. But the bilateral mechanisms we have to deal with these challenges are the best we've ever had. President Xi and President Obama have met numerous times. During my 4 years in Beijing, no American president visited China, and no Chinese president visited the United States. They had some meetings at the APEC summits in other countries, but that was once a year. Now, every year, there are constant meetings between the president and the president of the two countries. When properly utilized, these consultative mechanisms, which include presidential meetings, can help contain frictions, damp down controversies, and explore possible resolutions. What I am trying to say is that a confrontational relationship between China and the United States is simply not foreordained. It would require mistakes and poor understanding of national interests for leaders in the two countries to let our relationship become a hostile one. So why should we worry? Because the strategic rivalry between China and the United States has not yet been stabilized. China is rising, and its rise is challenging the dominant position that the United States has enjoyed in the Western Pacific ever since the end of World War II. And to manage an issue like that requires presidential leadership. In my judgment, neither side is handling this fluid situation yet with the skill and consistency necessary to strengthen confidence in the future of the relationship. So there are grounds for worry because we don't see a constant press for the type of relationship that needs to emerge if we are going to contain this rivalry. Anyone who visits China and any Chinese who visits the United States will find that mutual suspicions abound and that this nurtures public attitudes that can be inconsistent with long-term policy objectives. Because both leaders, the leader of China and the United States, do not wish to see a hostile relationship emerge between the two countries. But that means you need a public opinion that supports the measures necessary to prevent a hostile relationship from emerging, and instead we constantly see stories and statements that lead to suspicion rather than strengthening the desire for cooperation. Any new administration will have to deal with the reality that the rise of China poses the major strategic challenge facing the United States. Washington cannot afford to neglect East Asia. Regardless of what it is called, the substance of the strategic balance that the Obama administration has been using to define our relationships in East Asia, the substance is likely to remain in place. The challenges will be enormous, however. Under President Xi Jinping, China is moving more assertively to promote its interests in East Asia. It is generating a host of new initiatives that bear a Made in Beijing stamp, replacing a 15-year period during which all of the new proposals for architecture in East Asia came from the Southeast Asian countries, not from the major countries in the northeast of Asia. Now China, just over the last 3 years, has begun to push forward its own ideas. Given China's rapidly growing economic, political, and military clout, this, frankly, is not an unnatural development, and it's not a surprising development. Why would China continue to stay in the background when its economy has already emerged as one of the two largest economies in the world? And, I stress this point, Xi Jinping's proposals as president of China have not been designed to exclude the United States. Some Americans think that that's all China wants to do, is to drive the United States out of East Asia. But if you read what's emerging from China, that is not the picture that one sees. Nevertheless, China's emerging activism poses an obvious challenge for the United States. But I would stress this point. We think that the rise of Chinese leadership in Asia means the United States has to push our leadership forward more aggressively. I would argue that's the wrong approach. The issue in East Asia is not whether the United States is or is not asserting leadership. It's whether the United States has the staying power to remain in East Asia militarily, economically, politically, and in every other way. East Asian countries, including our allies and our friends, do not wish to have to choose between Chinese leadership or American leadership. They want to take advantage of the conditions that have existed in East Asia for most of the last 30 years, whereby everybody was cooperating together, and you didn't have to line up with one side or the other. The conflicting claims to land features in the South China Sea are part of this larger picture. The predominant U.S. interests are in preserving freedom of navigation, strengthening a rules-based order, and in fostering peaceful resolution of the disputes. The building blocks for such an approach are in place, but they are not receiving adequate attention. Every time we talk about the South China Sea, we should have some reference to the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea that was signed by China's current foreign minister as a special representative in 2002 with all of the foreign ministers from the 10 ASEAN countries. If all of those 11 countries had adhered to what they had agreed to adhere to, you would not have the current tensions in the South China Sea. U.S. interests will be best served by adhering to strict neutrality on the territorial claims, lowering the profile of its freedom of navigation operations, and giving greater weight to diplomacy in its approach. Let me conclude with just a word or two about U.S. policy. In my judgment, U.S. policy should be based on realistic assessments. China is surrounded by powerful neighbors. Beijing can no more dominate East Asia than the United States can retain the dominance we used to have when China was militarily weak. The goal should be to forge a stable military balance between China and the United States. Such a balance should have two characteristics. Each side should possess capabilities sufficient to deter the other from using force to settle serious difficulties. And each side should lack the dominance that could, in the eyes of the other, foster aggressive intentions. Can we get there? We don't know. But if we don't get there, we will have enormous waste of resources in both countries on military competition, which would be better used if diverted in other directions. The United States should capture the dynamic in its own approach to the region. When China is assertive, it irritates its neighbors, and they want the United States to be more heavily involved in East Asia. But when China acts responsibly, all of its neighbors, including U.S. allies, all want to cooperate with China and enjoy the economic benefits of that approach. For effective implementation, this means the United States must integrate its military presence, its economic, and its diplomatic strategies in East Asia. I think that's possible, and that's the challenge that whoever wins our presidential elections will face in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. I think that's a very insightful, comprehensive presentation. And we certainly will, I believe, probably other aspects would pay great attention to that. Our next speaker is Dr. Chen Li. Dr. Li is a good friend. And he, as me, also with a fellow Shanghainese, came from Shanghai. And he first came to UC Berkeley, studied Asia Studies, and I guess probably Professor Scalapino's supervised, and also a very admired and a very, familiar friend. And he then went to Princeton, studied political science, and earned his PhD there. He is now the director and the senior fellow at the leading institute, the leading think tank in the United States, in fact, probably worldwide, the Brookings Institution, John Thornton Center for China Studies. And he published, extensively with a forthcoming one. He just brought an example here with the title, Chinese Politics in the Xi Jinping Era, Reassessing Collective Leadership. This is actually prepared also for analyzing the forthcoming 19th Chinese Party Congress. For that, although it's still, forthcoming, dozens of invitations already posted to him to ask him to analyzing the Chinese politics. So he is actually specializes, especially in Chinese elite politics and Chinese politics. And I guess it's by it is actually very logical. Graduated and studied politics in Princeton University. Turned out to be an expert of Chinese leadership's prince and princesses. So that's a very interesting coincidence. So let's welcome Dr. Chen Li and to see what he's going to say. Welcome.
Dr. Jia Hao, thank you so much for that overly generous introduction. I wish my mother were here, and she would believe every word. I'm honored and privileged to speak to this distinguished audience, mainly my fellow Chinese Americans, and also to speak alongside Ambassador Stephen Roy. Ambassador Roy, as John mentioned, was born in Nanjing, China. During the welcoming banquet of the Hangzhou G20 early this week, President Xi Jinping particularly expressed appreciation for another U.S. ambassador to China, John Layton Stewart, 司徒雷登, who was born in Hangzhou, not far away, and lived in China for over 50 years. In my view, both Ambassador Stewart and Ambassador Roy are more Chinese than Chinese people. Stephen, it's wonderful to be in the same panel with you and to have heard your wisdom, your very insightful remarks. And many thanks for your long-standing support for Chinese Americans. I'm also very thrilled to see my longtime friend, Henry Wang Huiyao, in the same panel, along with his wife, Miao Lu, and talking about the connections, with Princeton. I hope that your children, the twins, will both go to Princeton. Now, my assignment for this panel in the next 10 minutes or so is twofold. First, to assess the status and the prospects of U.S.-China relations. And second, to discuss what constructive role Chinese Americans can play. Now, for the first, I would like to make, at the risk of oversimplification, two general observations about the U.S.-China relations. First, U.S.-China relations are increasingly shaped by domestic factors. China is at a historical moment of economic and social-political transformation. We may also argue, or reasonably argue, that American politics is becoming increasingly incomprehensible and also bizarre, not for Chinese, but also for us as Americans. Now, secondly, there are a number of paradoxical developments or trends in U.S.-China relations. Some significant accomplishments have recently achieved in U.S.-China relations on global issues, as Ambassador mentioned, and I also just very quickly want to repeat, such as economic rebalancing, poverty relief, climate change, peacekeeping, anti-terrorism, and nuclear non-proliferation. But both countries continue to confront serious tensions on regional issues, especially in South China Sea, East China Sea, Taiwan, and also the missile defense system, the THAAD. Now you see the tension, the contrast between global issues, you see more cooperation, but the regional issues are more confrontation or tensions. Now meanwhile, the bilateral relationship has also witnessed some paradoxical development. For example, while China and the United States lack trust and are increasingly suspicious of each other's strategic intentions, people-to-people contact, whether be educational, cultural, or tourism, has never been broader and deeper than today. Just an example that 2 months ago, I was on the maiden flight of United Airlines between Hangzhou and San Francisco. And United, along with many other airlines, created new flights between these two countries. And every day, there are more than 10,000 passengers. And this number will further increase. As those of us who fly United, we heard the term that fly the friendly skies. But unfortunately, people paid too much attention on the dangerous sea and not just pay much attention to really the aviation development, the cooperation between our two countries. Now, all of these contrasts, contentions, and the complicities call for greater effort to achieve a more active engagement with, or have more profound understanding of US-China relations. Now, in that regard, I believe that the constructive input of Chinese American is particularly valuable. I want to also make 2 points on this regard. For the first, if domestic politics is a central factor for the relationship, we should not shy away from it. In the United States, we Chinese Americans should make sure we have a fair say. We should protect and advance our civil rights, as the previous channel so vividly, so effectively, articulate that. One can challenge our analysis, but one should not challenge our loyalty. Now, what makes the Chinese Americans American is what we believe American values: democracy, human rights, justice, rule of law. And most of these values are not culturally determined. So therefore, they are also, we believe, universal values. Now, it's the best interest for China to respect and promote these values. So this is linked to our views of the Chinese domestic politics. Now, Chinese Americans are well positioned to promote these values. And of course, that we do not need to lecture China, because the period that China served as the only student of the United States is coming to end. And I think it's much better we share our civil rights experience in the United States, share American experience like President Obama constantly emphasized, through this kind of dialogue, this kind of emphasis on the common challenges with certain degree of humility. This is the most effective way to do. So I think Chinese Americans are well positioned to articulate that eventually China becoming a great power in the world ultimately should reflect China's own political development. And China's present itself to the neighboring countries, the entire world, what China represents, why China's rise is peaceful, and also that China makes solid progress in China's own political transformation. Now, of course, each democracy is different, but there's some basic criteria we should meet. So also as the Chinese Americans, we are not lack of cultural sensitivity. So we will not be perceived ill-intended. So I think in these two fronts, we can do a lot of things. Now, secondly, US-China relations, as Ambassador mentioned earlier, really caught up in a situation that most Chinese think that's the American conspiracy against China, want to contain China, which is largely false. At the same time, we Americans, a lot of them believe that China constitutes a serious threat, want to kick the United States out of Asia Pacific, want to dominate the world, become another superpower, which is also, as most of us probably will see, it's groundless, particularly look at the Chinese culture and China's internal discourse. But unfortunately, these two views get a lot of momentum. So in many ways that we see the contradicting trends. If we really want to contain China, why you open China with so many other ways, cultural, educational, and many other fronts? The same things. If China really wanted to threaten the United States, why you engage with trade, with many other fronts, environment cooperation, and anti-terrorism, and etc. So there's a lot of flaws in these two perceptions. So therefore, my argument, which has been the point I constantly mention in conferences in China, in the United States, if the United States and China are engaging in war, it's not because of ideology. Unlike the Cold War, there's a fundamentally different ideology. In China, you do see the cultural differences, but it's not like I want to defeat you, or I have the communist ideology. The same thing, you see the kind of really cultural exchanges. And the younger generation in China, whether trained in the United States or trained in China, become more cosmopolitan. We do not see this kind of ideological conflict. Also not necessarily caused by conflict, because we do have more shared interests, not caused by interest. So what will cause the tensions or even a war is misperception, mutually reinforced fear, and misjudgment. This will be extremely dangerous. Now, as the people, Chinese American, we are basically bilingual not only just language, but also cultural understanding of each other. We should play a very important role to use the language that Chinese can understand to explain to Americans the changes in China, to use the language that the Chinese could understand to explain Americans' goodwill for China. United States and China should be partners, should be friends, should not be enemies. Let me conclude by saying the 21st century world cannot afford a war between China and the United States. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chen. As always, his presentation is thoughtful, comprehensive, measured, and outspoken. Our next commentator, just by chance, Dr. Huiyao Wang, Henry Wang, came from China, joined our convention, and he would say few words about that. I just, in terms of introduce himself this morning already, I just want to mention three things. First of all, we met, I believe it is probably 1998. It was also a large, conference in Washington, D.C. with the overseas returned Chinese scholars. And Huiyao, Henry came from Canada. In terms of what he is now doing in China, I think it's a very, very interesting and also very, constructive and imagination. He is the founder and the president of the Center for China and Globalization, which is the largest right now and also probably the most successful social think tank institution in China. People know, although the Chinese authorities paying great attention to the think tanks, the importance, but to be a real think tank, it's not easy. And secondly, he has also done a great job in terms of consulting for the Chinese government. He is actually one of the representatives advising the State Council, as a senior counselor. So let's welcome Dr. Henry Wang and to hear from him about his views. Thank you.
And may I just interrupt just real quick? We are running behind, and so if I may suggest that we try to keep this program going, and if we could keep it down to would 3 minutes do? Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much, because otherwise it wouldn't be fair to all the panelists behind this program. Thank you so much. Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Zhao, for the kind introduction. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So it's really great to attend this section, and I was quite impressed with what Ambassador Ruo and Dr. Chen Li just mentioned. I think they both has expressed the importance of Sino-U.S. relations and how important for all the Chinese American here as well, that we should keep the peaceful momentum going and also the good relations among the both countries, because the two countries are so important and as a cornerstone to the peace and the stability, not only to the China and the United States, but also to the world. So I think as Ambassador Roh has old China hand and grew up in China, and his view has well represented quite a mainstream view in the United States that China and United States have so much in common. And I think Chen Li is also very forthcoming as strengthening that China and the United States are really friends and partner, and that really we should, as beneficial to all of us, to maintain such relations, and it's really important that we keep that. I would like to just add two common observations. I think China and the United States are really at crossroads now, and both countries are now become number one and the number two largest economy in the world. And I think that there's basically two cornerstones to this relationship. One is that people-to-people's relations. I think this is really the number one most important. And we've seen that since China and the U.S. established diplomatic ties almost 35 years ago. And so that we have seen so much common going on among the two countries for the people-to-people exchanges. For example, most of the people stay here in this room probably benefit from this exchange. And now we see the student exchange is really large and among China and the United States. So China has actually, since China opened up, there's about 5 million students have gone up study overseas. Now there's only, there's about already actually more than 2 million has been studied in the United States. And we see the tourism is going on as well. So I think this is the people-to-people exchange is very important. And also now the U.S. has launched a 100-strong study to China. But I think there's a big deficit for the student exchange. There's about 300,000 students coming from China to the United States, and there's only about 15,000 students from U.S. to China. So I think all of us here can really promote more students from U.S. to study in China. And the second observation I would like to add is that I think the trade relation is still also very important to keep the good relation. As China and U.S. the largest trading partner among each other, actually, so this is really crucial. But now we've seen a trend that now the U.S. has proposed the TTP and TTIP, and we see China is leading AIIB and also the OBOR and RCEP. So I think this probably is good now since the TPP has some difficulty in the United States. I would like to suggest maybe we should also consider FTTA, which is a scheme proposed in Asia Pacific region that including both TPP and RCEP. So I think that really can combine both groups into same trading bloc that really benefit both countries. So finally, I would like to say that China and the U.S. are really cemented by these two strong relationship because between the people-to-people exchanges and also between the trade relations. So I'm very honored, I think, that to be here and to hear all those good comments. And I'm sure that all the distinguished audience at this room can really contribute to these two important relations, to these two important pillars between China and the United States. That people-to-people exchanges should be strengthened, and also the trade relations should be strengthened. I think if we actually have these two really promoted, then I think political stability and peaceful relations can be sustained. That's my comment. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Henry. Because we are running out of time, so and also the next panel is also very important subject: Chinese investment in the United States, with a group of entrepreneurs, businessmen, as well as close friend Kaiyuan Wang, and also the other friends. So, but anyway, if you have any views and you would like to exchange with Ambassador and also Dr. Chen Li and Dr. Henry Wang, we can do it, after this session. Thank you so much, and thank you for the panel.